So passed in 2014, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is this historic and complex series of bills that require the formation of local agencies to develop and implement groundwater sustainability plans, or GSPs, to achieve groundwater sustainability within 20 years of plan implementation. And prior to passage of the act, groundwater in California's 515 alluvial groundwater basins was largely unregulated. And so passage of SGMA, as it's commonly referred to, represents this marked transition, both in terms of regulation, but also in this transition from a dearth of information about the groundwater basins themselves in the state to collecting, synthesizing, and really using information about these basins to drive management decisions. And this includes really understanding the both current conditions within the groundwater basins, but also the future conditions. And, you know, for those of you who had the pleasure of seeing the supply forecasting panel, I think Brad really teed this up well. He talked about the importance of groundwater to metropolitan's water supply, but also the importance of really capturing excess or waters during periods of wet periods or periods of excess and recharging that. And so part of what we're going to hear about today is some of the tools and science around groundwater recharge, and then also how do we take information about these basins and really make it actionable as we think about implementing this complex piece of legislation. And so part of why this is so important is groundwater here in California is, I think, often one of the forgotten components of the water supply system, but it really does represent between about 30 to 60% of the state's water supply during any given year. So it's really critical that we get implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act right. And so when we think about groundwater systems themselves, we really think about, you know, what's the water going into the system? How are we recharging it? And that happens either through natural recharge, through rain or infiltrating snowmelt, or through managed recharge. And again, we're going to hear a little bit about that, but that's either through wells, through recharge ponds, or through on-farm recharge or other mechanisms. And then we can think about discharge from the system through subsurface flows, discharge to surface water bodies, or through groundwater pumping. And so achieving groundwater sustainability ultimately requires balancing these water budgets. And that occurs either by increasing the amount of supply or recharge to the system, or reducing the amount of demand to the system. And that happens either through groundwater allocations or other demand reduction strategies. So again, we'll hear a little bit about that. The other really critical piece in all of this is that because formation of the implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act required the formation of new agencies, we're really seeing this transition in terms of, as I mentioned, the science and information that are being collected. But importantly within that is helping both local agencies as well as the landowners that are ultimately responsible for implementing this piece of legislation, communicating that science and information in usable ways for those groups, for both decision-making, but just understanding why the policies that are developing are doing so. And so we're going to talk again about some of that today. So with that, because our goal is to have some discussion time, I'm going to stop talking. But I'm really, really pleased with this panel because we really, with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, part of what we've seen is just this need for a diversity of interests and expertise to come together to really understand what is the science, what's the policy, how do we have actionable science coming out of it. So we've got Kristin Sicke, who is the General Manager of Yolo County Flood Control and Water Conservation District, the shortest title ever, and Executive Officer of the Yolo County Groundwater Sustainability Agency, who's going to really give us the local perspective. So she's going to talk about groundwater management in her agency, some of the science and data they've been collecting, as well as the partnerships that she's formed to really ensure groundwater sustainability in the region. Then we're going to hear from Meredith Goebel, who is a research scientist here at Stanford within the Department of Geophysics, She's going to talk about some of the geophysical methods that they have been developing and providing to local groundwater sustainability agencies. And importantly, the way that they're really making those data accessible and supporting decision-making. And we're going to hear from Daniel Mountjoy, who is Director of, I need to read this, of Resource Stewardship with Sustainable Conservation. He's going to be talking about the groundwater recharge assessment tool that Sustainable Conservation has developed. And it's really focused on how do we operationalize groundwater recharge in ways such that districts can really understand if we do have periods of excess, where do we put that in a very functional way, and the way that they've integrated data and science into that. Finally, we're going to hear from Mike Myatt, Senior Director of the Climate Resilient Water Systems at Environmental Defense Fund, who's going to talk about, again, Environmental Defense Fund's interest in this work, as well as some of the partnerships that they've formed to scale an open source groundwater accounting platform and how that communicates parcel-based water budgets to landowners. And so I'm not going to read their full bios. I would encourage you to do so, though. It's a very, very impressive group of individuals. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kristin.
I'm Kristin Sicke, General Manager of Yolo County Flood Control and Water Conservation District. I am trying to rebrand, like Yuba, become Yolo Water, where we're living our best life every day, right? Because you only live once. I've been General Manager of the irrigation district for about 8 years now. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is not my good work, but all the people that have come before me and all their efforts. And so here is a map that's showing our district. Even though our title is Yolo County Flood Control and Water Conservation District, we're technically an independent special irrigation district. So our service area here is shown in the yellow polygon. We cover about 200,000 acres in Western Yolo County. And the Yolo County boundary is shown in that kind of highlighted tan or white color there. Our two primary supply or water supply sources that we provide to the farmers in our irrigation district are actually located up in Lake County. So that blue blob there is Cache Creek Watershed. We are responsible for irrigation and flood releases from Clear Lake and Indian Valley Reservoir. And once the water is released from there, the water travels about 65 miles in Cache Creek, where downstream we divert it in the Cape Hay Diversion Dam. We have a 160-mile unlined canal system, which you can see on that image in the right middle there. It's kind of a bird's eye view of the creek is coming down from Cape Hay to just north of Woodland, and then the other blue lines are just the canal system network and how it fans out there. We divert about 225,000 acre feet on an annual basis in a good year, of course, where about 150,000 acre feet of that water is put onto farmers' fields. We, for the most part, can provide this water about 7 of every 10 years. That may be changing, obviously, in the future as the climate changes. But historically, we've had a pretty good record of having sustainable surface water for this area and providing that in lieu benefit to the aquifer, but also this recharge benefit. Because we have an unlined canal system, every year that we are providing irrigation water, we provide about 25% to the aquifer. So the earthen canals act kind of as a leaky recharge passive system there. Given our history, we were formed in 1951 by the legislature to go and find surface water supplies. For about 15 years, we were looking for them, but we didn't have surface water supplies. And so we were primarily responsible for managing and monitoring groundwater. And so given our history of an involvement in groundwater since the 1950s, we felt kind of responsible to take the lead in assisting the county and other eligible entities in the county to form the Groundwater Sustainability Agency. We now have a 26-member joint powers agreement of a Groundwater Sustainability Agency, and our irrigation district serves as the administrative and technical support services. So the other hat I wear is I'm the executive officer of our Groundwater Sustainability Agency, known as the Yolo Subbasin Groundwater Agency. We submitted our groundwater sustainability plan in January of 2022, and pending DWR's review, we still don't know what they think about it. We're implementing it as if everything's okay. So this groundwater sustainability plan that we developed shows that historically we've been sustainable. Historically, because of the really good surface water supply that's available to the community, and because of all the recharge that occurs, things have been okay. But it also suggests that moving into the future to continue this historical sustainability, we need to ensure that there's continued recharge efforts and more investments in recharge and adding additional supplies. Groundwater is really important to the region. About 95% of groundwater use is actually from the agricultural users. And during wet years, kind of similar to the state of California, 40% of the total supply is groundwater usage. And then during dry years, about 65% is of the total supply is from groundwater. And so during the dry year, obviously, groundwater, similar to other areas, is a very critical reserve for us. And it's something that we want to continue to have available so that farming can continue, and also so that rural residential wells can continue on. The primary supply for the majority of the rural properties in the county is groundwater. So the data and the science that we have been using as part of sustainability planning is kind of similar to other areas. We have this 75-year period of groundwater elevations in a very robust groundwater monitoring network. We have over 500 wells in our network. And so given all that really excellent data, we were able to select a subset of those wells to then include in the groundwater sustainability plan. And we essentially set our minimum threshold, or the level that we don't want to go below, at the historical low point. If we were able to bounce back from that low point before and the basin could handle that, we believe we can continue to do that in the future, with the exception of continuing to promote recharge in the region. We've made significant investments in our supervisory control and data acquisition system, where we actually have real-time groundwater monitoring wells that help us. We have about 31 real-time groundwater monitoring wells. And that is a very helpful tool to show farmers and the community what's happening in a real-time basis with the groundwater elevations. It allows us to forecast out what's going to take place by the end of the water year, where we expect to be by harvest, and what the potential is for where we can just go up from there through any recharge in the winter. We clearly use OpenET, similar to other groundwater sustainability agencies, to assist us in our groundwater reporting process. That has been a very helpful tool, because politically there is some concern in the community for requiring metering of wells. And so allowing us to have access to OpenET has been immensely helpful for trying to budget on an annual basis. We're really looking forward to DWR's release of their aerial electromagnetic survey. Obviously they put it out, but there's a lot of data files to go through. And so we want to use that data to assist us in finding ways to recharge the aquifer better, to see where it's most conducive to putting excess water into the ground. So in addition to our passive recharge that occurs during the irrigation season, our irrigation district has obtained a temporary permit from the State Water Board for the past 8 years to divert excess surface flows in Cache Creek and to bring it into the canal system during the winter. We have to balance or manage many different objectives during that time, but for the most part, it's been successful. 4 of the 8 years, the hydrology has worked out for us. We've recharged about 27,000 acre feet over those 4 years. And it's very evident in looking at the real-time data, the nexus there on the recharge and how much that helps the shallow aquifer. And it's been a really helpful tool in communicating with the State Water Board about us being responsible stewards and being able to report on the connection there. In addition to that, we want to expand it and take excess flows and put it onto farmers' fields. We've been partnering with Sustainable Conservation and with the Nature Conservancy to try to pilot a few on-farm recharge projects, and to give farmers the tools that they need to make these decisions about when it's the best timing to alter their field and bring the water on, and to show them the benefit of it. So another partnership that has been immensely helpful is we've been working with EDF and the Water Data Consortium recently, because even though on a subbasin perspective, we do believe we're sustainable, we want the state to stay far away. On a kind of a smaller scale perspective, we do have hotspots and we do have what we're calling areas of special concern, where we have started to see downward trends and we are observing subsidence occurring. And we want to make sure we mitigate or rectify that. And so we've started to have conversations about potentially implementing a voluntary allocation system in those areas. And in working with EDF and Water Data Consortium, they're developing a groundwater accounting platform, which is a very wonderful structure that creates this tool that allows us to ultimately have a parcel by parcel distinction of how much surface water may be available and how much groundwater may be available to a piece of property, which is going to be wonderful for farmers to be able to forecast into the future of how much ground may they need to fallow, or what sort of decisions do they need to make. Excuse me. So that's something that I'm really looking forward to. The most difficult, heaviest lift is going to be working with the community to make sure that there's buy-in and agreement on having to make these changes. But so long as the data is helping to support these decisions, I think there's not much that you can dispute so long as you have the support there. And so that's just the summary of Yolo in a little nutshell, and I'm happy to answer questions later in the program.
All right, great. That's a good tee up for me. Again, my name is Meredith. I'm a research scientist in the geophysics department here at Stanford. And I'm here today because of the work our group has been doing, looking at how we can use geophysical imaging techniques to help better understand our groundwater resources and hopefully inform management decisions. And one problem we've been working on in particular over the past couple of years is the question of how to best site manage aquifer recharge projects. And there's a lot of different things you need to consider when you're trying to find the optimal sites for recharge. And we're really only focused on one of those. And that is, where do we find sites where the subsurface is such that we will maximize the quantity and rate of water getting down through the subsurface down to the aquifers past our water table? And this is not necessarily an easy question because the subsurface is really complicated. So you have a lot of heterogeneity, and at a good site, you're going to have interconnected pathways through coarse grain materials, that's sands and gravels, which allow water to move rapidly, as opposed to clays or other fine grained materials, which can act as barriers to the flow of water. And so what we want to do is be able to map out the subsurface sediment type, identify the ones with lots of coarse grain materials, but traditionally we would use things like wells or cores to do that. And often those data sets are just not sufficient to capture the spatial complexity, especially when you're trying to make really targeted decisions. And so we use geophysical imaging, which is pretty much analogous to medical imaging, in order to map out what the subsurface looks like. So just like you might go get an X-ray or an MRI, we can apply very similar techniques to understand the subsurface. And the particular property we measure is called electrical resistivity. And it's really great in this situation because sands and gravels tend to have high electrical resistivity relative to clays and other fine grained materials, which have low electrical resistivity. I'm going to skip through all the physics and details and just go straight to results. So this is what the data look like from one of our systems. So this is one of our smaller systems. It's a todium system shown in the picture up top there. And what you're looking at is the data we collected at a single almond orchard. And we can see from the ground surface down to about 45 meters below the ground surface. That's where the water table is. And the colors, you can think of this as resistivity. I've transformed it to sediment type. But what you can see is even at this really small scale, this is an individual orchard, there's a huge amount of variability in the subsurface. So we have packages in red where we likely have sands and gravels, and those would be really good for recharge, and you might be able to map connected pathways through those down to the water table. And there's also areas where you have a whole bunch of this blue fine-grained material, which would be poor for recharge. And so data like this would be useful at the site scale to say, okay, well, this site might be good or bad, or maybe I just want to block off a small portion of this site and use it for recharge rather than trying to flood the whole field, which can have consequences. We also have these data available at a much larger scale. And so this is the airborne EM system. This one's towed beneath a helicopter. And if you've never seen these before, I'll tell you, this data is remarkable. So be impressed. The scale and scope of these is incredible. This is mostly the data set collected by the Department of Water Resources in the Central Valley. We have some of our Stanford data thrown in there as well. And we're looking at electrical resistivity from the ground surface down to about 300 meters. So wherever you see variation and different patterns, that is telling you about the structure of our aquifer systems. And we can start making interpretations about, where we might have good places for recharge. So in red, we have our coarse grain materials. Those could be places where you want to target future studies or efforts for doing recharge, and areas where it's green and blue might not be as good. And so hopefully I've motivated to you that these data sets are really useful. They've contained a lot of important information that could be used to understand potential recharge pathways. But what we realized as we started working with these data and developing workflows to turn them into decision support information was that in reality, most management practitioners that we were working with didn't have the technical expertise or just the time and capacity to ingest data like this. And even if we published in peer-reviewed literature, made our publications open access, anyone can read them, they're not going to be able to recreate what we've done. And so we've spent the last year developing a web-based application where users can go into our GIS interface. They can select the area that they're interested in evaluating recharge sites at, and they can either pull from an online database that we've compiled that has all of the publicly available geophysical data as well as some other data sets, or they can upload their own private data. And then they can launch a cloud compute session using our compute resources that will walk them through our entire workflow that we've spent the past couple of years developing to turn these data into what we hope are actionable decision support products. So a variety of different 2D maps that say, this area is good or this area is bad for recharge, depending on what metrics you're interested in evaluating. So that's what we've been doing. This is literally hot off the presses. Our beta launched less than a week ago. So if you're interested, use it, give us feedback. We're really excited about this, but I'll also say, just to tee up the next speaker, that this is just one consideration when you're choosing recharge sites. So, the subsurface might be perfect, but there's lots of other things you have to think about. And hopefully that'll be a good transition for Daniel going next.
Well, that was perfect introduction. Thank you. So I'm Daniel Mountjoy with Sustainable Conservation. We're a nonprofit group operating here in California. We work with a variety of landowners, agencies, academics, and others to find solutions to our water challenges and that make economic and social justice sense, as well as environmental sense. One of the products that we've developed recently, or actually 7 years ago now, is the groundwater recharge assessment tool. And this really came out of questions we were hearing from irrigation districts in the San Joaquin Valley. These were the questions that we heard from them. We collaborate with the Earth Genome, another nonprofit that does data management of big data sets and really are key to developing this tool. But these are the questions that we hear most often from irrigation districts. This was prior to SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and even more so now are these questions about where should I do recharge? When should I do recharge? When is it compatible? How much surface water can I actually capture? And actually aligned with that one now is the question of how much flood water can we reduce if we do divert that water to avoid some of the floods that we saw this year? What would it cost? In other words, where's the best, most cost-effective strategy? And how much of that groundwater overdraft can we address with a solution like this to bring ourselves into balance with sustainability? So those are the questions that drove this. And I just really want to emphasize that tool development and data collection really needs to be driven by the end user. And that's the approach that Earth Genome and Sustainable Conservation take. We're not out to generate products that you should use. It's more you tell us what's needed, and we find products and tools to help you answer those questions. As Meredith keyed up here, the recharge suitability is indeed a first piece of that question. And There's a variety of different tools already in existence. The Soil Agricultural Groundwater Banking Index was developed by UC Davis to talk about the top 6 feet of the soil, because you have to get it through that first 6 feet. It doesn't really matter what's below if you can't get it through the top root zone. Land IQ developed a map using the well log data that Meredith mentioned earlier, which was all we had 5 or 6 years ago, was the USGS well log data, and mapped out the Central Valley recharge suitability based on that and the surface conditions. And then really the bottom image here is what Meredith was talking about with aerial electromagnetic imaging. And this is really presenting us with incredibly new opportunities, like these pathways of coarser grains, materials that can, if you can get it through that topsoil and then find one of these pathways to move it further down. And most recently, Woodard & Curran, another consulting firm, has been developing an index to really update the Land IQ's index to be able to integrate not only the coarseness of the material, but depth to groundwater, the soil surface and salinity aspects of infiltration, the grade and slope of the soil. So a number of factors that determine those geophysical acceptability. Great site, but you can't get water there. Doesn't really matter. So the second piece that we integrate into this model is conveyance capacity. And this is a data set that is really hard to come by. Each irrigation district has their own maps. Sometimes they're old CAD maps, sometimes they're hand-drawn maps, sometimes they're modernized to GIS. But we've found that that's a very data-intensive process of compiling that information to be able to understand where can we move water, how much water can we move to a place based on irrigation system designs. Also thinking about the streams and rivers that we can divert off of, how much flow is in those rivers. All of that has to be incorporated into thinking about where is their recharge potential. And then, of course, the next piece is land use compatibility. Not every piece of land is a landowner willing to have flooded. So we've done extensive work on crop compatibility, which crops can take water during the winter months, and maybe in January, February, they can take it, but they can't in March, but maybe they can take a little more water in April and May. So looking at dry down curves and access to getting into fields, if we're really going to make use of larger anticipated flood events, we have to be able to capture water quickly. Recharge basins are great, but we can't buy all the land in the valley to do that. So we're looking at land uses that are compatible. In urban areas, that might be parks, might be riverways, it could be floodplains. There's a whole variety of different land uses that each have various characteristics that make them more or less suitable to recharge. And then we put all this together in the groundwater recharge assessment tool, the site suitability piece, the crop compatibility piece, rank all the sites and where there's conveyance is shown in orange, and then look at temporally what's the hydrology, the hydrograph of water availability in different types of water years. We call it water available for recharge. And looking at the canal capacity, because those canals only have a certain amount of, you can move through them, and especially if you're in delivery season when they're moving other water, you can't put more water in a canal than it can carry. We then route that to all the fields that are available and create a groundwater recharge quantity. And anything that's not used really needs to be considered in terms of water remaining in the river and flood risk. So we're working right now with the Department of Water Resources on a concept called flood managed aquifer recharge, looking at future climate scenarios for flood risk, at how much water we can divert off of these systems, put on farm to address or on any land use to address the groundwater need, but also how much can we mitigate flood impact in the future. And the user interface for individual districts allows them to rank all their fields and think about which fields we want to put it on, has cost elements in terms of what it would cost to incentivize landowner to participate in it. And what I wanted to say about this is really that this tool is highly complex, but what we're learning is that districts really don't necessarily need all this complexity. They don't need to rank every field. What's been most impactful is understanding what that recharge potential is. Those first 4 questions are really the questions that are needed, is what's our potential, what's it going to cost? Once they realize what that is, they go into all sorts of creativity to generate incentives and crediting and programs to develop to achieve that. And it's going to all come down to farmer willingness or landowner willingness. And we can rank them all and go into a lot of detail, but it's really the generation of the conversation that developing the tool starts. And the input of the data, the compilation of all this disparate data in one place gives water managers and decision makers the ability to then start thinking about, well, gosh, we could incentivize recharge over here to do this. And that's the other piece that's really evolved, is thinking about where you do recharge matters. Kristin mentioned some areas where there's starting to have locations where you have dropping groundwater levels. We have disadvantaged communities whose wells are drying up. We have groundwater dependent ecosystems that are going dry, and the rivers systems are no longer supporting aquatic habitat. And we're now able to start to identify with groundwater models where the best places to recharge are to tackle each of those objectives. And in this example on the far right, a single well over there in Merced County, the white line is if we did nothing, groundwater levels are going to continue to drop. The green line is if we did recharge to address groundwater dependent ecosystems and subsidence, we can raise it up a little. Or if we're concerned about that community drinking water well with the star, we should put it in these near the DACs and near these groundwater retention areas. And that significantly increases the amount of water that we can retain. So with scarce water in dry years, we need to put it where it's most needed. In wet years, probably there's enough to put everywhere. But this is really the thinking that we're starting to generate now, is how do we think about targeting recharge for the greatest good? Stop there.
First, before I get started, I just want to say I was one of the ones at the first one of these data summits, I think, in a small classroom. And it's just really cool to see how it's grown, and super excited and appreciate the inclusion of a groundwater panel this year to talk about some agricultural water stuff too. So my name is Mike Myatt. I work for EDF. EDF's been around for over 50 years, doing a lot of work in climate resilience and biodiversity in a number of different areas, including water. And our water program, sort of like Kristin, it's climate resilient water systems, but I just like to call it our water program. It's a little bit easier. Is really spans Western states in the United States right now. And my role is to oversee our program in California. We have several different priorities and ways that we work. We focus on multiple benefit projects and outcomes. We engage with partners and communities in almost everything that we do. We will develop guidance to help fill gaps and advise folks in complicated areas. And we don't shy away from policy and advocacy. I left data for last, even though it's second on there, probably for obvious reasons, given the reason why we're all here today. But it's a really important foundation of the work that we do. And the project that I'm going to be talking about today brings all of them together, which is kind of cool. And it's the groundwater accounting platform. Kristin mentioned this earlier because we're lucky enough to have her as one of our pilot partners in this work. The vision for this was really, it's been going back several years when we got started, to create a tool that will support water managers at the Groundwater Sustainability Agency level and others communicate with their constituents, with their landowners, bringing together reliable data and information, and create open source tools to help facilitate those conversations and have a trusted source of tracking groundwater use, which is incredibly important as allocations are being set in the state. So we started in 2018 working with a water district called Rosedale Rio Bravo Water Storage District. Eric Averitt was at the helm at the time, and he's a real visionary for this project. And we importantly, from the very beginning, sat down with the water managers and the farmers there to ensure that we were building a tool that would actually be used and be useful for them. And that led to the creation of a platform that they're still using today that tracks annual water allocations in near real time. So it's almost like a banking account if you go online to check your balance, except it's for groundwater. So as agencies are on the difficult road towards reaching sustainable conditions under SGMA, there's a lot of hard conversations and a lot of hard decisions that need to be made. And having a tool that everybody can look at and trust can be really helpful. go to the next one here. So I don't have a lot of time to go through what it is. I chose a very simple screenshot because really the point of this is for it to be simple and easy to understand. And a little nod back to the previous panel, our team, I'm pretty sure, used ChatGPT to come up with silly names of farming operations. So that's why we're looking here at Chicken Little. So this is not, we're not like sharing anybody's private information here. But the way this works in this view, this is the water budget view. And you can see this on like an annual or a monthly basis. And water managers can see this in their whole basin, or an individual landowner can see just their parcels. And you can basically just see how is your water use doing against the available supply that you have, or how are you doing against your allocations. Over on the left side, there's that account activity button you can press, and that brings up what looks like a bank account, where you can see, the expenses are like your water use, and the income is like your water supply that's available to you, or your allocations. We measure water use using OpenET, as Kristin mentioned, being important in her district. That's kind of the default setting in the platform, and it's an important way of measuring evapotranspiration to fill that gap so you can actually get to consumptive use. But the tool is very flexible. It's designed so that it will work with whatever policies and tools already exist. So if folks are already using Land IQ, we can do that. If people want to use meters and have their allocation set around that, one of our pilot partners is interested in that, we can do that as well. There's also a lot of other features I don't have time to show you, like mapping, and you see user permissions on there. This crowd knows open source does not mean open for all. You can have privacy and security embedded in it, and that's really important. So another thing I want to talk about, in addition to just the tool itself, is just the way it's been built and the way it's rolled out, and all the partnerships that are a part of this. This is, started with EDF in Rosedale and their farmers, and we were very lucky to partner up with the California Water Data Consortium, who were successful in bringing in significant state and federal funding to support building out this platform and helping to scale it across the state. And it's always better to bring in diverse voices and have the experts in the room when you're building it, so you're sure you're building something that's going to work for folks, and to have different perspectives. Each region has their own unique challenges, their own concerns. And so we have 5 pilot partners that we're working with that are shown here on the left side. You can see there's 2 in the Merced Subbasin and Pajaro Valley. We're still working with Rosedale. And then Kristin from Yolo Water, I'm going to be an early adopter of your rebrand. On the right side is our team. And so I'm privileged to get to work with Tara and her team very regularly on this project at the California Water Data Consortium, and the technical brains behind all of this. We have really great team from ESA and Olson, and their GET engine, the groundwater extraction toolbox, which allows for incorporating modeling and scenario planning, which is something that we're going to be bringing into the tool. I'm going to leave on this slide. I hope I piqued your interest enough. I know I didn't go through it enough to really get what it's about totally, but this is our new landing page, groundwateraccounting.org. It just launched, I think, in June. This is the place that folks that use the platform will go to log in and actually see their information. It's also the place to go for more information. So in the coming weeks, we're going to be rolling out like demonstration videos, and it already has information about what it's all about, and a lot more screenshots I was able to show you in my limited time. So I'll stop there so we can get to the Q&A.
Awesome. Well, thank you all to all of our incredible panelists. I really liked Meredith's quote of, yeah, you should be impressed. This is pretty awesome. So we have about, I'm going to say 15 minutes, even though I know I'm standing between you guys and the reception, but I think we have 15 minutes, and I have some questions, but I would love to hand it over to all of you if there are questions in the audience. And so I don't know if there are any burning questions that all of you would like to ask. I see a hand back there.
My question is for Meredith. I am curious about the geophysical imaging that you use, and whether it is some kind of combination of ground penetrating radar
and versus like satellite radar. I'm just very, and the airborne electromagnetic scanners.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Yeah, so this particular system, or the measurements I showed today, they're electromagnetic measurements. And so they're made by basically sending a magnetic field down into the subsurface and measuring the response of the Earth to that. So kind of like radar, but instead of sending a radar pulse, we're sending a magnetic field pulse. So, and it can be laid out on the ground surface. It can be towed, like I showed, behind a ATV, beneath a helicopter. They're doing float TEM now. They put it on paddle boards. So there's lots of different imaging techniques, but this particular one is called electromagnetic imaging.
So, oh, I see another hand here. Perfect. And keep them coming. And if not, I have questions. And this group had questions of one another too. So I'm also going to encourage them, if they want to ask each other questions, they can do so.
So this may or may not be answerable at this moment in time.
Ooh, I like
I'm
these
just sort of
questions.
curious. So with Floodmar, right, in recharge, there's water rights component to that. There was a recent executive order this past water year where we had N423, where there was the incentive to do more of that. With these tools and stuff, do you see a legal pathway or a regulatory pathway that's going to help optimize these tools to be used for the purposes of trying to find those best sites for Floodmar and bigger projects that state takes on, or whatever that is? Like, sort of, could you speak to a little bit about piecing those pieces together?
Sure. The water rights piece, and we didn't talk about that here. There's a whole bunch of other data that's needed to answer that question, which I think is key. And I'll just say that, preserving enough water in the river systems is essential to have functional flows, and that's a really big opportunity right now. The other aspect of it, though, that is in the legislation and SB 122, that was the subsequent passage after the executive order, also had a lot about water quality and concerns about doing this recharge dispersed across the landscape. What are we going to do to those drinking water wells? And we've been having a lot of conversations with the disadvantaged communities who are balancing this thing between, we want water to come out of our taps, but we also want it to be drinkable. And if the choice was water but not drinkable, would you take it, or would you want no recharge at all? And that's really being discussed a lot right now. The models and tools we have at this point are more about water quantity and supply, and the models for water quality are still in the works and being developed. And that's another whole data management piece that a number of us are talking with the state about, and just trying to monitor this year's massive amount of water spreading across the landscape to see what kind of effects did occur near those communities with all that water being flushed through, historic legacy agricultural lands. And so these are all data pieces that we're engaged in, and others here I think are probably engaged in right now.
And I don't know, Kristin, did you want to talk about some of the temporary change permit that you?
Yeah, so we've been using a temporary permitting process that started under Governor Brown's executive order at the end of 2015. And it's one we still use. I don't know how it's not expired, but it's one we still use to ask for a temporary permit. And we've had conversations with the State Water Board, continuing to remind them about the unique hydrology and the need to really have flexibility in their permitting process and not have it be just a blanket permit or condition, I should say, because of we can be disconnected from the Delta at times. And so we do think there's excess water that's not going to injure or impact a downstream user. But that's a very unanswerable question.
Well, it's a great question too, because it's also been driving a lot of research more recently, where sort of looking at extreme floods and can we take sort of like past the 90% exceedance, for example, and have that not impact water rights. So I think we're seeing a lot of good research coming out around that, but definitely a lot of opportunities. And it looked like Mike might want to chime in there too.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think one of the last thing you asked about, it just shows the interplay between policy change and data and tools and how they can nudge each other along. So with that policy change, creates an opportunity, and you need information to know where to seize the moment. And that's some of what Daniel's working on. And with better data, creates an environment where you can have new policies because people can see it's possible. And so that's playing out before our eyes right now.
This may be another unanswerable question, but you've talked a lot about water and water quality, groundwater recharge. There's been research from Utah and Colorado where they've looked at the reintroduction of beavers and the impact on the hydrology. So how do you see increases in biodiversity, reintroduction of historic wildlife, and the impact that that might have on your decisions?
We just did a survey of beaver opportunities in California because it is becoming an interesting topic. There's a lot of interest in it because of their ability to restore that natural hydrologic process. The challenge is having beavers near irrigation systems and canals is a real challenge. And there's all sorts of beaver deceiver technologies out there that develop ways that the beaver plugs up something over here, but the water still makes it around. You probably are familiar with some of those. The agricultural areas in the state are not very interested in introducing beavers. And you're next on this one. But there's also a trend towards expanding some of our floodplains for flood protection. And the beavers might be more appropriate in those areas if we can exclude them then from moving out of those floodplains into agricultural supply and road infrastructure, culverts, and that sort of thing. So there's still a lot to be worked out on it. But they're here already. They're in California. And there's a number of sites where they're doing what they've always done and storing water and holding water back.
Yeah, if we could strategically place them, I think it would be a win-win for all. So maybe I need to look into the beaver deceiver, but if we had like a beaver achiever to like give them a goal of where they should go, I think that would be really helpful. Because right now it's just viewed as a nuisance. They tend to obstruct areas that need to have stormwater runoff or conveyance. And then it just causes a huge problem in our county. So.
Great. Well, we actually had a great discussion amongst the five of us when we were talking. And so I think given where we're at with time, I'm going to ask, I'll start with, we talked a little bit about grappling with sort of imperfect data and how we can manage around that and still use it to drive good policy decisions without it sort of hanging up our ability to make those decisions. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about that. And maybe I'll just start with Meredith then.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we're definitely more on the research side of things, but I think the approach that our group has taken is being really careful about communicating what you can and cannot do with confidence with these data. And then also with all the partners that we've worked with, at first people were really scared of uncertainty. They want the answer. They want, this is how it is 100%. And so getting people more comfortable with uncertainty and understanding how you can use uncertainty as a tool, specifically in the context of defining what your problem is, and then understanding whether uncertainty does or does not matter in addressing that problem. Because if the decision you make is going to be the same regardless, then it doesn't matter. If you have uncertainty and it does impact your decision, okay, use the uncertainty to guide where you're going to go in and get more targeted information. So from the research end, that's kind of been our approach to uncertainty and communicating it for decisions.
And we find that people want that perfect answer. They want the number, and we can spend forever trying to come up with the number. And so what we've been really finding is trend data, because we have a tool that works out over 20 or 100 years. What direction is the line going? And let's not be so concerned about whether it's a 35% increase in floodwater or a 25% increase in water. There's going to be an increase in floodwater. So how do you manage around that? And then knowing that as we move down the line, that will continue to refine itself as we have better data and more information. Some of the earlier talks about we can't predict climate change as well as we'd like because we don't have any historic data to build it off of. But using trends and also ranges of data we find is enough to get action started. It's a heck of a lot better than just using historic data that doesn't tell us very much. So, and working with the Department of Water Resources, we've been working with 30 different climate change models and looking at sensitivity to all of those. And it doesn't really matter which one you use as much as, what's the trend, what's the direction, and should we be changing behavior? And that's really the key message.
Yeah, ditto to the above. Agreed with all of that. I think it's also really important to have clear short-term objectives and to make sure you identify the goal. Because obviously analysis paralysis can consume us all. And as long as we can identify what those objectives are, and try to build credibility that, this is going to be an adaptive management process. So trust me, once we get to this point, then we'll reconsider and we can change course if we need to, but we have to continue to move forward.
That was all good stuff. Yeah, I just want to say ditto, ditto, ditto. I guess I will add, making decisions with imperfect information is scary. And there's a lot on the line sometimes. So I don't envy the folks in those positions always, but not making a decision is a decision. And we face really dire situations in water management, and we just can't have inaction. So I think it's leadership to be able to make a decision when you don't have all the information you wish you had. And it's having an understanding of the folks that are impacted by that decision, and then being honest about the quality of the data, acknowledging it's not perfect and acknowledging the consequences, and helping them understand the path forward and what happens if you don't make that decision.
Okay, so it is exactly 4 o'clock right now. And I think I'm going to just end it there, but would encourage you to reach out to any of our panelists. Happy to provide contact information. I think most of them are going to stay for the reception. Please do ask them additional questions. We had a great discussion together, and thank you for the great questions and for listening. And thank you to all of you for the great talks.